3 weeks before my wedding, my father stood up in front of our entire family and announced that he wanted a DNA test because he believed I was the product of my mother's affair. I was 32 years old, a successful nurse practitioner, and I had spent my entire life being treated like a mistake he couldn't prove. What he didn't know was that the DNA test he demanded would expose a secret buried for more than 3 decades, reveal that I wasn't his daughter or my mother's daughter, uncover a hospital cover-up, and destroy the lie he had used to punish my mother for 32 years. By the time the truth came out, another woman would walk into my engagement party. An entire room would fall silent, and my father would realize he had spent half his life accusing the wrong person. Chapter 1. The ultimatum that broke everything was 32 years old when my father decided he wanted proof that I belonged in my own family, not proof that I loved them, not proof that I had spent my entire life trying to earn his approval, proof that I carried his blood. The irony was that by then I had already built a life without him. I worked as a nurse practitioner at Stamford Medical Center. I owned my own townhouse in Stamford. I paid my own bills, paid down my student loans, and was 6 months away from marrying the kindest man I had ever known. Yet somehow, none of that mattered, because in my father's eyes, I was still the little blonde-haired girl who didn't look like an Ashford. The dinner started like every other family gathering. My parents' oceanfront home in Greenwich was glowing with warm lights. The dining room overlooked Long Island Sound, and the sunset painted the water in shades of gold and orange. My mother, Diane, had spent the entire day preparing for the gathering. She looked happy, for the first time in months. She actually looked relaxed. The family was there to discuss two upcoming celebrations: my engagement party with Noah Bennett and my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. At least that was the plan. Richard Ashford had other ideas. Halfway through dinner, he set down his wine glass. The sound echoed across the table. Every conversation stopped. I knew that look. The same look he always had before he said something that would leave my mother in tears. He reached into a leather folder beside his chair and placed several papers on the table. My stomach tightened immediately. My grandmother Eleanor noticed too. "Richard, what are you doing?" He ignored her. His eyes stayed fixed on me. "I won't be attending your wedding unless you agree to a DNA test." The room went silent. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Noah slowly lowered his fork. My mother looked like all the air had been punched out of her lungs. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dad, maybe this isn't the time." "It is exactly the time." Richard's voice was calm, far too calm. "I've waited 32 years for the truth." He pushed the papers toward me. "DNA testing registration forms." I stared at them. "You can't be serious." "I am." His jaw tightened. "You've never looked like anyone in this family, Evelyn, not me, not Ethan, not my parents, not a single Ashford. You've got blonde hair and blue eyes." "Where did that come from?" Mom flinched, the same way she always did whenever he said things like that, because this wasn't new, not even close. This was simply the latest chapter in a story that had poisoned our family for decades. When I was 10 years old, I fell off my bicycle and split my knee open. I remember blood running down my leg while Mom begged Richard to drive me to the emergency room. He refused, said she should call the real father. When I graduated high school, every seat in the auditorium was filled except one. My father's mom cried in the parking lot afterward and pretended it didn't matter. When I received a partial nursing scholarship, the university needed one final financial document signed. Richard refused. He said he wasn't obligated to fund another man's child. I ended up taking out loans. A lot of loans, $118,000. I worked nights waiting tables, studied during the day, completed clinical rotations whenever I could. Some nights I slept 3 hours, sometimes less. But I graduated anyway, not because my father believed in me, because I stopped needing him to. Back in the dining room, I could see those memories reflected in my mother's eyes. Richard wasn't attacking me. Not really. He was attacking. He always had been. Mom's hands trembled. "Richard, please, not tonight. Not again." "Agon?" He laughed. "That's rich coming from you." Eleanor slammed her hand against the table. "Enough. For once in your life, leave her alone." Richard didn't even look at his mother. I deserve the truth. Ethan finally spoke. Dad, maybe there's a better way to handle this. Richard nodded. There is. She takes the test. Sybil. His eyes found mine again. Unless she's afraid of the result. The challenge hung in the air. Noah reached for my hand under the table. His grip was steady. Grounding. I squeezed back. For a moment I wanted to stand up and leave. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, because walking away wouldn't stop this. Nothing ever stopped it. Dinner ended shortly afterward. Nobody finished eating. Nobody even pretended. By the time Noah and I got back to my townhouse, it was almost midnight. I thought the worst part of the evening was over. I was wrong. Around 1 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Mom. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. Her voice sounded small, fragile, like glass about to break. Can you come over? 20 minutes later, I was sitting in her kitchen. She looked exhausted, older than 58, older than she had that morning. We sat in silence for a long time. Then she finally spoke. 7 years ago, I almost ended my life. I froze. What tears filled her eyes. I never told you because I didn't want you carrying that burden. The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet. She told me about the pills, the ambulance, the psychiatric counseling afterward, the months she spent trying to convince herself to keep going. All because of years of accusations, years of suspicion, years of being treated like a criminal for something she never did. I felt sick. I had known she suffered. I had never understood how deep the damage went. Mom reached across the table. I need you to know something. I've never been unfaithful to your father. Not once, I believe you. The answer came instantly, without hesitation, because I always had. When I left her house that night, something inside me had changed. This was no longer about proving who my father was, or wasn't. This was about clearing my mother's name. The next afternoon, the fallout began. Patricia started calling relatives. By evening, family group chats were exploding. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly had opinions, some sympathetic, most curious. A few cruel, then came another blow. Mom received a polite email informing her that her participation in an upcoming family charity event was no longer needed. No explanation, no direct accusation, just enough humiliation to make the message clear. People were already choosing sides. Then Richard escalated everything. At 8:43 that evening, my phone buzzed. An email notification. The sender was my father. The subject line made my stomach drop. The truth before the wedding. I opened it. Attached was a childhood photograph of me. Someone had circled my face in red. Below it was a message sent to 63's relatives. A message questioning whether I was truly an Ashford. A message that practically put my mother on trial. Replies were already pouring in, questions, speculation, rumors, judgment. I sat alone in my living room and read every single one. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking, not from fear, not anymore, from anger. For 32 years, my father had treated suspicion like evidence. Now he wanted to put my mother on display for the entire family. Fine. I looked at the email one last time, then I picked up my phone. I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I would take the DNA test. But I wasn't going to stop there, because if Richard Ashford wanted the truth, I was going to find all of it, no matter where it led. Chapter 230. What years of fleece. The next morning, I drove to Genetica Diagnostics before work. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's email. The red circle around my childhood photograph, the comments, the whispers, the certainty with which people judged my mother without a single piece of evidence. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting in a small collection room, holding a consent form. The technician smiled politely. I signed the paperwork. A cheek swab took less than 30 seconds. 32 years of suspicion reduced to a cotton swab. That part felt almost insulting. Getting my mother's sample was easy. She agreed, immediately. Getting my father's was different. Richard thought the test would prove everything he had believed for decades. He practically volunteered. By the end of the week, all 3 samples were on their way to the lab. Then came the waiting. And waiting gave me too much time to think. I started remembering things I had spent years trying to forget. Growing up, I always knew Ethan was my father's favorite. Nobody ever said it out loud. They didn't have to. The evidence was everywhere. When Ethan turned 16, Richard bought him a brand new Jeep Wrangler. The kind of gift that made every kid in town jealous. When I turned 16, I got a used bicycle from a neighbor who was moving to Florida. Richard told me it would build character. When Ethan got accepted to the University of Pennsylvania, my father threw a party. He invited relatives from 3 states. He toasted Ethan's future. He called him the pride of the Ashford family. When I got accepted into nursing school, Richard barely looked up from his newspaper. Congratulations. That was all he said, one word, nothing more. The difference wasn't money. It wasn't opportunity. It was affection. Ethan received it freely. I spent my entire childhood chasing scraps of it. The older I got, the more obvious the pattern became. Every achievement from Ethan was proof of the Ashford legacy. Every achievement from me happened despite Richard, not because of him. Looking back, I realized something even darker. His treatment of me was never really about me, it was about my mother. I was simply the weapon he used against her. Every birthday, every holiday, every graduation, every family gathering. The accusation was always there, sometimes spoken, sometimes implied, but always present. Diane carried it for decades. The more she defended herself, the worse Richard became. I remembered one Christmas when I was 14. A simple argument about decorations somehow turned into another accusation. My mother cried in the kitchen while guests pretended not to notice. Richard walked away without apologizing. He never apologized, not once. A few days after submitting the DNA samples, I started digging through the family email thread Richard had created. The deeper I looked, the uglier things became. Old messages surfaced. Conversations that stretched back years. Parse I had never fully seen before, and one name appeared constantly: Patricia. My Aunt Patricia. Every rumor somehow traced back to her. Every whispered suspicion, every careless comment, every suggestion that my mother was hiding something. Patricia was always there, adding fuel, encouraging speculation, keeping the story alive. One message from nearly 10 years earlier made my stomach turn. Maybe Diane knows exactly who Evelyn's real father is. Several relatives had responded. None defended my mother. Not one. I sat staring at the screen in disbelief. The isolation suddenly made sense. The awkward family reunions, the invitations that never came, the strange looks. The silence whenever my mother entered a room. Patricia hadn't just spread rumors. She had poisoned entire branches of the family. Meanwhile, the situation at home kept getting worse. My mother received fewer calls, fewer invitations, fewer messages. People weren't openly attacking her. That would have been easier. Instead, they simply disappeared. The rejection was quiet, polite, American. And somehow that made it hurt even more. One evening, Noah invited Ethan over for a beer. I wasn't supposed to overhear the conversation, but their voices carried through the partially open patio door. For a while they talked about work, sports, normal things. Then Noah asked the question everyone was avoiding. Do you really think your mom cheated? A long silence followed. Finally Ethan spoke. I don't know. It was the first time I had ever heard uncertainty in his voice. He continued, Dad's been saying it my whole life. When you hear something for 30 years, eventually part of you believes it. Another pause. Then he added something that surprised me, but maybe he's gone too far. Noah didn't answer immediately. Ethan sighed. I just don't understand why he can't let it go, neither did I. Maybe because deep down he never wanted the truth. Maybe suspicion had become more useful than reality. A week later, my grandmother Eleanor called and asked me to meet her. She refused to explain why over the phone. We met at a small cafe in New Haven. She arrived carrying a thick manila envelope. The moment I saw it, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. She slid the envelope across the table. I've been waiting a long time to show you this. Inside were documents, old notes, copies of hospital records, private investigator reports. I looked up. What is all this? Eleanor leaned back. In 2005, I hired an investigator. My heart skipped. Why? Because something never felt right. She lowered her voice, not about Diane, about the hospital. I stared at her. The hospital, she nodded. I couldn't explain it. Call it instinct, call it mother's intuition. But I never believed Diane was lying, and I never believed Richard had actual evidence. So I started asking questions. She explained how the investigator repeatedly hit dead ends. Records were missing, records were denied, employees refused interviews. Everything seemed unusually difficult. Eventually, the investigation stalled, but Eleanor had kept every piece of paper, every note, every lead, every unanswered question. Then she handed me a copy of my birth record. I studied it carefully. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then she pointed at the time. I looked closer. 11:47 p.m. My mother had always insisted I was born just before midnight, but she remembered a different time, a later time, 12 minutes later. The discrepancy was small, almost meaningless. Yet suddenly it felt enormous. Why would she remember it differently? Eleanor watched me process the information. Maybe it's nothing, maybe it isn't. I folded the document carefully. For the first time, the possibility entered my mind, not infidelity, not secrets, something else, something bigger, something nobody had considered. 3 days later, the email from Genetica Diagnostics arrived. I was sitting alone in my office during lunch. My hands immediately started shaking. This was it. 32 years of questions, 32 years of accusations, 32 years of pain, reduced to a single report. I opened the file. The first result appeared on the screen: probability of biological relationship with Richard Ashford, Zell%. My chest tightened. I stared at the number, read it again, then again. My father wasn't my biological father. For a moment I couldn't think. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, my eyes drifted lower. Is another section, another result. Probability of biological relationship with Diane Ashford. 0%. The room tilted, the blood drained from my face. I forgot how to breathe, and for the first time in my life I realized the truth might be far stranger than anything my father had ever imagined. Chapter 3. The other daughter. I spent nearly an hour staring at the report before I finally called my mother. She answered on the second ring. The moment she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. Evelyn? I couldn't find the right words. The report was still open on my laptop. The numbers hadn't changed, they weren't going to. I got the results. Silence, then a shaky breath. What did they say? I swallowed hard. They say Richard isn't my father. My mother didn't respond. For a second, I almost thought the call had dropped. Then I continued. They also say, you're not my mother. The silence that followed felt endless. No. Her answer came instantly, firm, certain. No. That's impossible. I closed my eyes. I know what the report says. No, she repeated it. I gave birth to you. I could hear her crying now. I carried you for 9 months. I went into labor. I held you. I fed you. You are my daughter. For the first time since opening the report, I felt something other than shock, hope, because my mother wasn't confused. She wasn't uncertain. She knew. And if she knew she had given birth to me, then there was only one explanation left. Someone had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. The next morning, I drove to Greenwich. My mother was waiting at the kitchen table. She looked exhausted. The report sat between us. Neither of us touched it. Finally, she looked at me. Do you know what I remember most about that night? I shook my head. The clock. Her eyes drifted toward the window. I remember looking at the clock after you were born. She paused. It was almost midnight. My mind immediately returned to the birth record Eleanor had shown me. The 12-minute discrepancy. At the time it seemed small. Now it felt enormous. What if they switched babies? The words left my mouth before I could stop them. My mother's face went pale. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she whispered, "Oh my God." Neither of us wanted to say it out loud, because if it was true, then everything changed, not just my life. Someone else's too. That afternoon I called Eleanor. She arrived within an hour. When I explained the DNA results, she wasn't nearly as shocked as I expected. Instead, she looked thoughtful, almost relieved, as if a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. I think it's time you spoke to Margaret Hale. The name immediately caught my attention. Who's Margaret? A retired nurse. Eleanor leaned forward. She was the head nurse on duty the night you were born. That conversation changed everything, unfortunately. Finding Margaret turned out to be harder than expected. The first time I called, she didn't answer. The second time, it went straight to voicemail. The third time, she picked up. The moment I introduced myself, she hung up. No explanation. No goodbye, just silence. Over the next 4 days, every attempt ended the same way. Either she ignored me or she disconnected. The behavior only made me more suspicious. One evening, Noah found me sitting at the dining table surrounded by notes and paperwork. "You look like you're building a criminal case." I laughed bitterly. "It feels like one." He sat down across from me. I explained everything: Margaret, the hospital, the birth records, the DNA results, the possibility of a baby switch. When I finished, Noah was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question I hadn't considered. "What if she's scared?" "Scared of what?" "Being sued." The answer hit me immediately. The next day, Noah arranged a meeting with a lawyer he knew through work, Laura Mitchell. She specialized in civil litigation. We met in her office in Stamford. After reviewing the information, Laura leaned back in her chair. "If a hospital knowingly concealed a baby switch, that's not a simple mistake." She spoke calmly, professionally. "That could involve negligence, fraudulent concealment, significant liability exposure." My stomach tightened. So, if Margaret knows something, then she may be terrified of becoming involved. For the first time, Margaret's behavior made sense. She wasn't avoiding me because she hated me. She was afraid. Laura agreed to send a formal letter requesting a conversation, nothing threatening, just enough to show we were serious. 3 days later, Margaret finally called. Her voice sounded tired, old, defeated. "I'll talk." Those 2 words felt like a breakthrough. We agreed to meet at an old diner in New Haven. When I arrived, she was already there, a small woman with silver hair and nervous eyes. The moment she saw me, she looked like she had seen a ghost. For several seconds she couldn't stop staring, then she whispered, "You look exactly like your mother." I sat down. Margaret looked around the diner before speaking, as if she expected someone to be listening. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I've been waiting 32 years for this conversation." What followed changed everything. 2 babies had been born that night, 2 girls, 12 minutes apart, one to Diane Ashford, one to another woman, a woman named Linda Morrison. Margaret's hands trembled as she spoke. "There was a nursing student." She paused. "Carla Benson." The name meant nothing to me. "Yet," Margaret continued, "she mixed up the identification bracelets." I felt my pulse racing. How long before the hospital realized? Her eyes lowered. "A few hours." The air left my lungs. They knew, the hospital knew. Margaret nodded, slowly. They knew. What happened? For the first time, tears appeared in her eyes. They decided not to tell the families. I stared at her, unable to process what I had just heard. They knew, and they hid it. For decades, Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a worn notebook, a nursing logbook. The pages were yellow with age. She slid it across the table. "Take it." I opened it carefully, names times, notes, birth records, and then I saw it, the Morrison family. The name sat on the page like a flashing beacon. Another life, another family, another daughter. Someone else had been living the wrong life for 32 years. As soon as I got home, I started searching. Finding Linda Morrison was easy. Finding her daughter took longer. Eventually, I found her. Claire Morrison, 32 years old. Elementary school teacher, Burlington, Vermont. I stared at her photograph for nearly a minute. There was something strangely familiar about her, not physically, not yet. Something else. A feeling, a connection I couldn't explain. I sent an email, no response. Then another. Still nothing. 3 days later, my phone rang. No number. "Hello?" A nervous voice responded. "Is this Evelyn Ashford?" My heart nearly stopped. "Yes." A pause. Then she said the words I had been waiting to hear. "My name is Claire Morrison." Over the next 2 hours, we talked about everything and nothing. The conversation was awkward at first. Careful, tentative. Neither of us knew how to discuss something this impossible. Then little details started appearing. Claire admitted she had always felt different. People constantly commented that she didn't resemble her parents. Classmates had asked if she was adopted. Even strangers sometimes pointed it out. I actually bought an ancestry DNA kit once. She laughed nervously. I never mailed it. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. By the end of the call, neither of us felt like strangers anymore. We felt like two people standing in the middle of the same disaster, trying to understand how it happened. Finally, I asked the question, the one that mattered most. Would you be willing to take a DNA test? The line went quiet. I waited. Seconds felt like minutes. Then Claire exhaled slowly. If we're going to do this, we should do it right. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, from anticipation, because for the first time since opening that report, I could see a path forward. The truth was no longer hiding in old records and forgotten memories. It was getting closer. And something told me we were about to find it. Chapter 4, Building the Case Waiting, became its own kind of torture. For the next several days, every notification on my phone made my heart race, every email, every unknown number, every message from Claire. Somewhere inside a laboratory, a simple DNA test was moving through a process that could rewrite two entire lives. While we waited, I focused on building something I could control. A case, not a lawsuit, not yet. Just the truth. Every evening after work, my dining room table disappeared beneath stacks of paperwork, the original DNA report, the nursing logbook Margaret had given me. Copies of birth records, notes from Laura Mitchell, screenshots of my father's emails, smas from relatives, timelines, names, dates. By the end of the week, it looked less like a home and more like an investigation room. Noah walked in one night carrying takeout containers and stopped in the doorway. Either you're solving a mystery or planning a federal prosecution. I laughed for the first time in days. Maybe both. He set the food down and started looking through the piles. How are you holding up? The honest answer was that I wasn't, not really. Because every new discovery came with a fresh realization of how much damage had already been done. Especially to my mother. The strange thing was that, once the possibility of a hospital switch entered the picture, people started reaching out. Not to apologize, not to make things right, just to satisfy their curiosity. Deanne received calls from relatives she hadn't spoken to in years. People suddenly wanted updates, they wanted details. They wanted gossip. One afternoon, I found her sitting alone on her back porch staring at her phone. She looked exhausted. Who was it this time? She gave a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Your cousin Melanie. What did she want? To know if the baby switch theory was true. I sat beside her. Did she apologize? Mom laughed softly. A sad laugh. No, that single word hurt more than I expected because she was right. Not one person had apologized. Not Patricia, not the relatives who had believed every rumor, not the people who quietly excluded her from family gatherings, not the people who spent years treating her like a liar. They were interested in the story, not the woman they had hurt. A few days later, another unexpected development appeared. Ethan called me. That alone was unusual. My brother rarely called unless there was a specific reason. Can we meet? His voice sounded different, more serious. An hour later, we were sitting in a coffee shop in Stamford. He looked tired, like someone who hadn't been sleeping much. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward. I think Dad's hiding something. I stared at him. What do you mean? He rubbed his forehead. I've been going through some old files at the office. Richard's engineering company occupied 2 floors of a commercial building in Greenwich. Ethan had worked there for years. If anyone had access to old records, it was him. I found a storage box in his private office. Something about his expression immediately got my attention. What was in it? He hesitated, then he pulled out a folded photocopy. I unfolded it. The letterhead belonged to a family law firm. The date was over 20 years old. My eyes moved quickly across the page. Then I froze. The attorney had written a straightforward recommendation. If Richard truly questioned paternity, he should pursue formal genetic testing rather than relying on assumptions. I read the letter twice. Then a third time, finally, I looked up. He had this? Ethan nodded. There were several letters. I felt anger building in my chest because this changed everything. For 32 years, Richard had acted as though uncertainty trapped him, as though he was a victim of unanswered questions, but he wasn't. He had been offered a path to the truth decades ago, and he chose not to take it. Why? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Ethan looked away. I don't know. But judging from his expression, I suspected he did deep down. Maybe we both did, because if Richard had taken a DNA test 20 years earlier, he would have lost the one weapon he used against Diane. Doubt. Without doubt, the accusations disappeared. Without doubt, he could no longer punish her. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine conflict in Ethan. The certainty he carried for decades was beginning to crack. And he didn't know what to do with it. Meanwhile, Claire and I continued talking almost every day. The conversations grew longer, more personal, less cautious. One evening she called while driving home from school. The sound of rain filled the background. I keep looking at old family photos. I smiled. Me too. It's weird. What's weird? She paused, knowing that somewhere out there, another family has pictures of the life I should have had. The words hit me harder than I expected, because I had been thinking the exact same thing. Every birthday, every Christmas, every school play, every graduation. Two girls living parallel lives, neither one where she belonged, and neither one knowing it. We talked for nearly an hour, about childhood, about family, about all the things we couldn't get back. By the time the call ended, I realized something important. Claire wasn't simply evidence, she wasn't a plot twist, she was another victim. Just like me, just like Diane. Then everything nearly fell apart. 3 days before Claire's results were expected, Margaret called the moment I heard her voice. I knew something was wrong. Evelyn, I don't think I can do this. My stomach dropped. What happened? She sounded terrified, a completely different person from the woman I met in New Haven. I received a phone call. My pulse quickened. From who? A lawyer. I sat upright immediately. A lawyer representing St. Catherine Medical Center had contacted her. Not directly threatening, not openly, just enough to remind her of old confidentiality agreements, old legal obligations, old risks. The message was clear. Stay quiet. Margaret was frightened. At 74 years old, she didn't want a legal battle. She didn't want publicity. She didn't want reporters. She wanted peace. And suddenly I realized how fragile our case really was. Without Margaret, everything became harder. Without her testimony, people could dismiss the nursing log, question the records, question the timeline, question us. After the call ended, I sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Noah eventually found me staring out the window. What happened? I told him every word, every fear. For the first time since this started, I genuinely worried that the truth might slip away. That night felt endless, the next morning felt worse. Then, shortly after noon, an email arrived from Genetica Diagnostics. I knew immediately what it was: Claire's results. My hands shook as I opened the attachment. I called Claire before I even looked. She answered on the first ring. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. We opened the report together. My eyes scanned the page, then stopped. Probability of biological relationship with Diane Ashford, 99-98%. A sharp breath escaped my lungs. I kept reading. Probability of biological relationship with Richard Ashford, 99.97%. Everything went quiet. Claire didn't say anything for several seconds. Neither did I. Because there it was. The truth, Sybil. Brutal, undeniable. 32 years. One report. And suddenly every missing piece fit together. Claire was their daughter. Their biological daughter, not me. Not after all these years. A few hours later, before I even had time to process the results, another message arrived. This one came from Richard. The subject line was short. Engagement party announcement. I opened it. My father had decided to make a public statement during the engagement party. He intended to reveal the DNA results in front of the entire family, in front of friends, business associates, everyone, the same way he had humiliated my mother for decades. I stared at the screen. Then I picked up the phone and called him. He answered immediately. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked one question. Are you ready for the truth? I looked at Claire's report lying on the table beside me. The report that could destroy every lie he had built his life around. A slow smile crossed my face. More than you'll ever know. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid of what would happen at that party. I was waiting for it. Chapter 5. The night the room went silent. The engagement party was held on a Saturday evening at the Delamar Greenwich Harbor, in a ballroom filled with white roses, champagne glasses, and nearly every person who had ever believed my father over my mother. 985 guests, relatives, friends, business associates from Ashford Civil Engineering, people who had watched Diane suffer for decades and called it private family business. My mother wore a pale blue dress. She looked beautiful. And terrified, Noah stood beside me near the entrance, his hand warm against the small of my back. "You don't have to do this alone." "I know." Across the room, Ethan was standing near the bar, quiet and tense. He had the old attorney letters inside his jacket pocket. Margaret Hale sat near the back with Laura Mitchell beside her. She looked fragile, but she had come. Claire was waiting in a private room down the hallway. She had texted me 10 minutes earlier. "I'm here. I'm scared, but I'm here." I wrote back, "So am I." Then Richard arrived. He wore a tailored navy suit and the expression of a man walking into his own victory parade. He kissed Patricia on the cheek, shook hands with business partners, accepted sympathetic looks as if he were the wronged husband, the wounded father, the man finally brave enough to expose a 32-year lie. Halfway through dinner, he tapped his champagne glass. The room quieted almost instantly. My stomach tightened. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He stepped onto the small platform near the front of the ballroom. "Thank you all for being here tonight." His voice was polished, public controlled. Tonight was supposed to be about celebration. My daughter's engagement, my marriage of 40 years. He paused, then looked directly at me. "But some truths cannot be postponed." Diane went still beside Eleanor. Richard unfolded a piece of paper. "I asked Evelyn to take a DNA test before her wedding. I did that because I have lived with questions for 32 years. Murmurs moved through the room. He continued. "The results are clear. Evelyn Ashford is not my biological daughter." Someone gasped. Patricia covered her mouth. Richard turned toward my mother. "And after all these years, Diane, I think the family deserves to know what kind of woman you really are." My mother flinched as if he had struck her. That was when I moved. I walked toward the platform slowly, not rushing, not crying, not shaking. Richard looked surprised when I reached for the microphone. For a second he resisted. Then he let go. Maybe he thought I was about to break. I wasn't. "You're right, Richard." The room went silent. "The DNA test says I'm not your biological daughter." His mouth curved slightly, almost satisfied. Then I looked toward my mother. "But it also says I'm not Diane's biological daughter." The satisfaction disappeared from his face. The room changed. You could feel it. Confusion moved through the guests like a cold draft. I lifted my phone and nodded to Noah. The screen behind the platform lit up with the Genetica diagnostics report. 2% with Richard Ashford, 0% with Diane Ashford. I heard someone whisper, "That can't be right." I turned back to the room. My mother did not betray my father. She did not lie. She did not have an affair. What happened was far worse than any of us imagined. I looked toward the side doors. Claire stepped in. She wore a dark green dress, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the room began to see what I had already seen, the Ashford jawline in Diane's eyes, Richard's exact dimple on the left cheek. Ethan made a sound behind me, something between a gasp and a broken breath. My mother rose from her chair without realizing it. Claire walked slowly toward the platform. I turned to the screen again. Claire Morrison was born at St. Catherine Medical Center the same night I was, 12 minutes apart. Noah switched to the second report. Her DNA shows a 99.98% biological match with Diane Ashford and a 99.97% biological match with Richard Ashford. The silence became absolute. No glasses, no whispers, no movement, just 95 people staring at the truth. Richard looked at Claire, really looked at her. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Margaret Hale stood. Her hands trembled, but her voice carried. I was the head nurse that night. Everyone turned. There was a mistake. A nursing student, Carla Benson, mixed up the identification bracelets after both babies were bathed. The hospital discovered it within hours. My mother covered her mouth, Margaret continued. The administration decided not to tell the families. We were pressured to sign confidentiality agreements. I was young, I was afraid. But Diane Ashford never betrayed her husband. Laura Mitchell stepped forward and held up a notarized statement. Carla Benson has provided a written declaration confirming the bracelet error and the hospital's internal response. It has been preserved with counsel. Richard's face had gone gray, but the worst was not over. Ethan stepped onto the platform, his hands were shaking. Dad. Richard turned toward him. Ethan pulled the folded letters from his jacket. I found these in your office. Richard's expression changed instantly, not confusion. Recognition. Ethan's voice cracked. More than 20 years ago, a family attorney advised you to do a legal paternity test if you truly had doubts. He looked at our mother, then at me. You refused. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan continued. You could have ended this decades ago, you chose not to. Richard opened his mouth, nothing came out. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. You didn't want answers. You wanted a weapon. That was the sentence that broke him, not the DNA, not Margaret, not even Claire. That sentence, because everyone in the room understood it. Patricia tried to step backward, but Eleanor's voice cut across the ballroom. Don't move, Patricia. My aunt froze. Eleanor turned to the room. And since we're telling the truth tonight, perhaps Patricia should explain why she spent 30 years repeating rumors she never had the courage to question. Patricia went pale. Nobody defended her. That was when the apologies began, quickly at first. An uncle approached my mother, then a cousin, then another. Words that should have come years earlier finally arrived, too late, but still necessary. I'm sorry, Diane. We should have believed you. You didn't deserve this. My mother stood there, crying silently. Claire stepped toward her. Neither of them seemed to know what to do. Then Claire whispered, Mom? Diane broke. She pulled Claire into her arms, not replacing me, not choosing her instead. Just holding the daughter she had lost before she even knew she was gone. I stepped down from the platform and walked to my mother's other side. She reached for me too. One arm around Claire. One arm around me. Ethan joined us a moment later. He didn't say much, just stood beside her, ashamed and broken, but present. When I looked back, Richard was alone. For 32 years he had demanded blood. Now blood was standing right in front of him, and none of it belonged to him anymore. Claire turned to him, her voice was quiet. You spent 32 years searching for your real daughter. Richard looked like he could barely breathe, Claire continued. But when you found her, you had already lost your family. He lowered himself into a chair, not dramatically, not like a man performing regret, like a man whose legs simply couldn't hold the weight of what he had done. No one rushed to comfort him. That was his karma, not prison, not bankruptcy, not public screaming. Just the quiet realization that the family he tried to control had finally stepped away from him. In the weeks that followed, the story settled into something less explosive, but more painful. St. Catherine Medical Center opened an internal review after Laura filed formal notice. Margaret gave a full statement. Carla's declaration became part of the record. No one could undo the 32 years we lost, but the truth no longer belonged to whispers. It belonged to documents. My mother met Linda Morrison 2 weeks later. Linda was 58, gentle and nervous when she walked into my townhouse. She had Claire's kindness in my eyes. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Linda took Diane's hands. Thank you for loving her. Diane looked at me, then back at Linda. She has always been my daughter. I cried then. Not because I was confused anymore. Because for the first time, there was room for all of it. The mother who raised me, the mother who lost me, the sister I should have known, the brother who finally understood. Ethan apologized to me in my kitchen a few nights later. I should have protected you. I shook my head. You were a kid too, but I wasn't a kid forever. That was true, so I let him sit with it. Sometimes forgiveness begins with not pretending the damage was small. Claire started visiting every other weekend. At first it was awkward, then it became natural. She and Diane were careful with each other, tender, curious. Linda and I took longer. But one afternoon, while she showed me old family photos from Burlington, I realized I was no longer looking for replacement parents. I was learning the rest of my story. Richard tried to apologize once, then twice. I listened. But listening was not the same as absolving. My mother moved into Eleanor's guest house for a while. She needed quiet. She needed distance. She needed to remember who she was before suspicion became the weather of her marriage. A few weeks later, Noah and I got married in a small garden ceremony overlooking the water. There were no dramatic speeches, no public accusations, no tests, no proof, just family. The kind chosen by love, not fear. When it was time to walk down the aisle, Richard was seated in the second row, diminished, silent, watching. My mother stood beside me, her hand wrapped around mine. She looked nervous. I smiled at her. "Ready, Mom?" She squeezed my hand. "Yes, baby." And Diane Ashford walked me down the aisle, not because she gave me her blood, because she gave me every piece of love she had left, even when the world told her I was proof of her shame. That day, I finally understood something. Family is not blood. Family is who chooses to love you when loving you costs them something. And if you were in my place, I need to know honestly. Could you forgive Richard after 32 years of damage? Or would some truths be too heavy to repair? Leave your thoughts below because I read them, and stories like this are never just about one family. They are about every person who was blamed for something they never did, and every person still waiting for the truth to set them free.